Hulk Hogan. He is one of the most, controversial people in wrestling history, but despite all the bad things he's done, you can't deny that he's had a huge influence on the business ever since the 80s. From helping launch the golden era in wrestling, and then the Attitude Era, from helping kill WCW to nearly killing TNA.
I got one thing to say about Six Sides. You had it, and it only got you so far. Now we're taking you all the way, Jack.
It's safe to say that the Hulkster has shaped wrestling into what it is today, for good and for bad, which makes it hard to imagine that history would have gone very differently if Verne Gagne wouldn't have been so freaking stubborn. Back before Hulkamania was running wild, brother, our little Hulky boy was rumbling and tumbling with the real wrestlers at Verne Gagne's AWA. Real wrestlers such as Wahoo McDaniel, Ken Matera, and Buck Zumhoff.
I got 3 words for you, baby. 911.
While he was there, Hulk starred in the famous movie The Rocky III. Because of that movie, he got a lot more eyes on him. He got a lot more fans. He got so popular that Verne Gagne just had to capitalize on it. So the match was made. On April 24th, 1983, Hogan would face AWA Heavyweight Champion Nick Bockwinkel for the title. The St. Paul Civic Center was standing room only that night. Mean Gene was on the call. Nick had Bobby the Brain Heenan by his side. Hulk came out to Eye of the Tiger. A stage was set for the torch to be passed, and for Hogan to take AWA to new heights. Terry the Hulk Hogan dominated Bockwinkel throughout the match. He gave Nick the signature Hulk special, hit the leg drop, ref counts to 3, and Hulk Hogan actually did it. He's the champ. The crowd explodes in cheers, while the Hulkster celebrates with all of his Hulkamaniacs. AWA and Verne was about to embark on a brand new era. And then they fucked it up. So right after Hulk won the title, Mean Gene announced that Hogan had been disqualified for flipping Bockwinkel over the top rope to break his sleeper hold. For those that don't know, it was a rule back then that you couldn't throw your opponents over the top rope, which means that Hulk didn't win the title, and Nick was still champ. The crowd rightly chanted bullshit, and everyone left frustrated, including many people involved in the match. Because within the year, Hulk Hogan, along with Bobby Heenan and Mean Gene,
I think you're sexy. Mean Gene, really, I do.
all jumped ship to the Fed. After they left, AWA never saw much success afterwards except for some shows here and there. By 1987, Hogan and the WWF were on top of the world, while Verne and AWA were desperately trying to keep their head above the water. More top stars left, Verne wouldn't change from the old ways, and by 1991, it all came crashing down and it hurt inside for old Verne, as AWA shut down in January that year. Now, I'm not saying that Hogan not winning that night was the sole reason AWA died, but it was one of the biggest piles of dirt thrown on its grave. Now, what if things went differently? What if Hulk Hogan kept the title that night? What if Hulk Hogan stayed in the AWA? Now, real quick, before I get too much into the scenario, I just want to make clear that all this is just my opinion on what could happen. I'm just theorizing. And if you disagree, that's okay. I'd be more than willing to discuss it more down in the comments below. Anyway, let's begin. Hulk Hogan really could have stayed in the AWA, at least for the time being, if Gagne had met his demands. Now I can hear what you guys are thinking. Oh, Hulk probably asked for so much money, and Verne probably had nowhere near that much. I understand why y'all would think that, but allegedly, that isn't what happened. Now what did Hulk want? To win the AWA Championship and get a bigger cut of his merch sales. That's it. So let's imagine for this scenario that Verne accepts this tremendous deal and Hogan stays. Realistically, Vince would probably just offer Hogan more and more money until he eventually jumped. But I want to be optimistic here. I want to think more creatively on this channel. So let's go down the AWA network timeline, folks. After our big boy Hogan wins the title, business is going to go real well for AWA. Even with Vern's old school style booking, they're going to sell out arenas, they're going to break into new territories, they're going to gain new fans. Because remember, Hulk was in the Rocky 3, which means more fans for the Hulkster and more fans for the AWA. With Vern being able to get Hogan to stay in the company,
You're going nowhere.
he could potentially be able to keep a lot of other guys in AWA as well, such as Sergeant Slaughter, the Rockers, Harley Race, and so on. And more top level names on the roster to work it out with Hogan would only be good things for AWA. Now, will AWA get their own rock and wrestling thing? No, probably not. Will they get their own WrestleMania? Sorta. Probably not as big and probably not as many celebrities, but I'm sure they could pull off some sort of big WrestleMania-like event with the good boy Terry Hogan at the helm. Now, in regards to their long-term future, I could see it going two ways, and it all depends on old man Vern. First, the pessimistic timeline. Even with Hogan, if Vern Gagne doesn't change his booking style and change with the times, I don't see AWA lasting that much longer than it did in our timeline. By the time the 80s rolled around, that old school booking style was already getting pretty tired. But going into the 90s with that, they wouldn't last too long. They would last longer than in our timeline since they got Hulk, but they wouldn't last much longer. I would give them till about the mid to late 90s at best. Hogan would likely just leave after a while, along with everybody else that stayed. We'd be pretty much just going right to the same timeline we're in now, just delayed several years. I honestly can't see them making it into the 2000s with that booking style. Now let's get optimistic. Very optimistic. If Vern changes his entire booking philosophy and gets to keep his cash cow, things could go very well for him. He could go into and out of the 90s as one of the top players in the wrestling business. Probably longer if Hogan reinvents himself like he did in our timeline, or he finds someone to be his next Hogan. Because just like in our timeline, the man can't be the big star forever. Not only could Vern and AWA keep Hogan along with several other top stars that didn't leave, they could potentially poach other stars from WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions. This could start a three-way war between these three companies to get the top stars in the business at the time. Now again, I'm being optimistic here. Vern would have to change his ways of booking completely and go with the times. Would this be very likely? I don't think so, but that's why I said I'm being optimistic. If all this happened, we could see AWA becoming one of the top business leaders of the 90s. Now let's talk about what happens with the other big boys. Like I said earlier, Vince McMahon would probably just keep offering Hogan more and more money until he accepted. Maybe even do some shady business tactics to screw with AWA. But it's not like Vince didn't have other guys he could use. He had Andre, Macho Man, Big John Studd, Roddy Piper, and more I probably can't think of right now. He also had guys coming later like Ultimate Warrior and Ricky Steamboat. He could even poach guys like Sting or even Magnum TA before the car crash. If Vince couldn't get Hulk, he'd probably just find someone else to build a company around. I could maybe see WWF eventually doing great business with whatever top guy they go with, just probably not as quickly and probably not as big as they did with Hulkamania. Y'all gotta understand that what Vince had with Hogan in the mid-80s was a huge lightning in the bottle moment. Now without Hulk himself, does the first WrestleMania still happen? Probably not, at least not in the way it happened in our timeline. When Hulkster jumped ship to the WWF, he not only brought all his fans, he also brought Mr. T with him. So Vince not only doesn't have Hogan, he doesn't have Mr. T either.
Quit your jibber jabber. You ain't hurt. You pathetic. If I ever catch you acting like a crazy fool again, you're gonna meet my friend Pain.
So who did they have? They had Cyndi Lauper thanks to Lou Albano. They also had Muhammad Ali. I could see them having him in a match instead of Mr. T. But who else? Billy Martin, Liberace, the Rockettes. Even if they got some other big names on the show, I don't think it would be as big of a success like the one on our timeline. I don't think it would bomb, it just wouldn't be as successful. Or WrestleMania could just not happen at all. WrestleMania was a huge gamble for Vince McMahon, and without a big name top star like Hulk Hogan, they could just not want to take that risk. Going into the 90s, I think they'll do fine, especially if they have their new top guy instead of Hogan, which by the early 90s, I think it'll be the Ultimate Warrior, especially since Hogan won't be in Vince's ear saying he isn't ready to be the top guy. WWF in the mid to late 90s would probably be similar to our timeline, especially if we go down the pessimistic route with AWA. If we go down the optimistic route with AWA, things could go pretty differently. People like Sergeant Slaughter, Scott Hall, Kurt Hennig, and Shawn Michaels could stay in the company. Things like that could drastically change the wrestling landscape in the 90s. I could even see wrestlers getting contracts a lot earlier in this timeline. These three companies would just tear each other apart to poach top names. Which brings me to the next company. In regard to Jim Crockett Promotions, I don't think much will change for them in the 80s and early 90s. Black Saturday still happens, Ted Turner buys them back, turns it into WCW, all that jazz. Even without Hulk Hogan, or Eric Bischoff because he'd likely still be in AWA, I still think that Monday Nitro still happens. Ted Turner would still want to compete with WWF, or possibly even AWA in this case, and unless they get another top star around that time like they did Hogan in our timeline, I don't think Nitro will do that great. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure they'd be fine at first, but I don't think they would beat Raw, or whatever show AWA would have, in the ratings as well as they did in our timeline without a big star like Hogan. There are only so many top name wrestlers to go around. Now with AWA in the mix, things would be stretched even more thin in regards to top names. WCW would have a much harder time getting Nitro to be a viable competitor to everyone else. Granted, this is all based on if we go down the optimistic timeline with Vern and AWA. Vern Gagne could just stick to his old school booking style and Hulk still leaves AWA, just later than in our timeline. If he leaves in the 80s, he would almost definitely go to WWF and we'd be right back into a timeline very similar to ours. But if he left in the 90s, it'd get pretty interesting. It's a real toss-up whether he would go to WWF or WCW. It'd pretty much just be who has the better offer. So we've talked about what happens to the main places the companies Hogan directly influenced. But what about everywhere else? Let's start with ECW. To those who don't know, Paul Heyman was in AWA as a manager for a short period of time, until he left for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988, which then led to him leaving Jim Crockett Promotions in the early 90s, then to him joining and taking over ECW. I think that Paul probably still takes over ECW no matter what timeline we go down with Vern. It's just a matter of when. If we go down the pessimistic route, it'll probably still happen around the same time it did in our timeline. But the optimistic route, probably the same, just a little bit later. Paul was destined to become a creative writer in wrestling, and I don't think he would have gotten an AWA no matter what. Next up is the NWA. If AWA sticks around as a strong entity, it's only going to get worse business-wise for the NWA. They were already struggling pretty badly in the early 90s. Adding AWA as a top competitor, on top of all of that, would not help them at all. Would NWA shut down because of Hogan staying in AWA? Tough to say. Personally, I don't think so, because even in the 90s, they still had a lot of promotions under their belt. Things would go bad in business-wise for sure, but I think they'd still be around not doing much, just like today. For all other promotions and territories, things would be pretty much the same, except they might get bought out by AWA instead. Imagine if AWA bought out somebody like Stampede Wrestling in Canada. They could get wrestlers on their roster such as Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, and even Bret and Owen Hart. That could be a wild timeline with some pretty interesting matches. To summarize everything up, Hogan staying in AWA alone wouldn't save the company. It would give them a few more years, but not much. Vern Gagne was a great wrestler and at one time a great booker, but he was a very stubborn man that did not want to change with the times. I doubt that he would budge and give Hogan those extra merchandising rights and the AWA title. I doubt a whole lot more that he would change his whole booking philosophy. In short, this scenario isn't that realistic, but it doesn't have to be. I didn't start this channel to only discuss alternate scenarios that would be realistic. I started this channel to discuss alternate scenarios that would be interesting, entertaining you would say, because despite what Vern Gagne believed, that's what pro wrestling is all about, entertainment, and Hulk Hogan staying in AWA would sure be entertaining. I'm currently debating what scenario I want to talk about next. I have a whole list of topics I want to eventually cover, and I hope to discuss all of them someday. Anyway, keep an eye out for the next video, as it should be out in the near future. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe to Kayfabe Alternate History so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching.